I'm a 26-year-old woman, and if you'd asked me about my family 5 years ago, I'd have said we were close. We were close. We weren't perfect, but my parents always emphasized hard work, loyalty, and the importance of sticking together through thick and thin. They weren't rich, far from it, but they worked hard to give my younger brother and me a decent life. All of that changed when my parents inherited a fortune, and I mean life-changing money. What happened next destroyed my relationship with them, and honestly, I still can't believe it unfolded the way it did. We grew up in a small, blue-collar town. My dad worked in construction, and my mom did bookkeeping for local businesses. They always talked about how they were building something better for us. My brother Jake and I weren't spoiled, but we didn't go without. My parents taught me to save every penny I could and made sure I understood the value of hard work. Jake, who's 3 years younger than me, was the golden child growing up. Don't get me wrong, I love my brother, but he wasn't exactly the most responsible person. He dropped out of college after one semester, bounced between part-time jobs, and mostly lived with my parents into his mid-20s. They doted on him, always making excuses, saying he's just finding his way. Things changed for me after I graduated high school. I got a scholarship, moved out, and worked my way through college. I didn't ask for much help because I knew they didn't have the money. I'd visit home when I could, but I mostly kept my head down, working 2 jobs to pay for rent and groceries. It wasn't easy, but I was proud of what I accomplished. I thought my parents were too, at least. That's what they said. Then, out of nowhere, my parents inherited millions. They had a distant relative, someone we barely knew, who passed away and left them everything. Apparently, this relative had invested well and lived frugally, so by the time they passed, they had a fortune to pass on. My parents had always struggled financially, so this was completely out of the blue. We were all shocked, but at first I was happy for them. They finally had the stability they deserved, and I figured they'd use it wisely. That's not what happened. Almost overnight, their attitude changed. It started small. They stopped picking up my calls as often, and when I did visit, they'd make offhand comments like, "You're so independent now, you don't need us." I thought I was imagining things until one day, Jake showed up at my apartment driving a brand new luxury car. I didn't even know he'd gotten his driver's license back. He'd lost it a year ago after a DUI. When I asked about it, he shrugged and said, "Mom and Dad thought I needed it to get my life on track." It didn't stop there. Jake started posting pictures of lavish vacations on Instagram: Paris, the Maldives, Hawaii. Meanwhile, I was working overtime just to make rent on my tiny apartment. When I asked my parents about it, they'd dodge the question or say things like, "We're just helping him out for now." It felt like every time I visited them, Jake had something new: a fancy watch, a down payment on a condo, even a personal trainer. They started treating him like a prince while I got nothing but excuses and vague reassurances. The real kicker came when I found out they'd been holding family meetings about managing the estate and hadn't even told me. I only found out because I stopped by unannounced one afternoon and overheard them talking about it. When I asked why I wasn't included, my mom just said, "It's complicated," and my dad added, "It's not your business. You didn't earn this money." I was stunned. Not only was I being excluded, but they were acting like Jake had somehow earned his way into their favor, despite years of being unreliable and frankly entitled. The favoritism kept escalating. They started openly comparing me to Jake, saying things like, "If you were more like your brother, you wouldn't be struggling so much." One day I overheard them talking to a family friend, saying I was a disappointment because I hadn't lived up to their expectations. That hurt more than I can put into words. I'd worked so hard to build a life for myself, but it seemed like none of it mattered to them anymore. At that point, I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. It was clear I was being written off, and I knew I needed to do something about it. I couldn't just let them treat me like I didn't matter, but I also knew I couldn't confront them head-on. Not yet, anyway. They were too caught up in their newfound wealth to see reason. Instead, I decided to bide my time and figure out exactly what was going on behind the scenes. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, I'd make sure they regretted it. After realizing I'd been pushed to the sidelines, I decided to stop waiting for answers and start finding them myself. If my parents weren't going to include me in discussions about the inheritance, I'd figure out what was going on without their help. I didn't have much to go on at first, but I knew one thing: my parents weren't exactly financial geniuses. This wasn't just a gut feeling. It was based on years of seeing them live paycheck to paycheck and struggle to manage even small sums of money. I had a hunch they were in over their heads. The first step was figuring out the basics of the inheritance. I didn't have access to every detail, but I remembered overhearing the fortune came with certain stipulations. I started digging through public records to see if I could find anything. It didn't take long to discover that the estate was massive, but it wasn't just a pile of cash sitting in a bank account. It included properties, investments, and trust funds, all of which required ongoing management. There were also significant estate taxes involved, something my parents didn't seem to have accounted for. The more I looked, the more cracks I found. It seemed like my parents were ignoring critical legal and financial steps to maintain the inheritance. They were spending money like it was endless, but they hadn't paid all the taxes owed on the estate. Worse, they'd started borrowing against the assets to fund their extravagant lifestyle. It didn't take a financial expert to see that they were digging themselves into a hole. I knew I needed professional advice, so I quietly consulted a lawyer. I was careful to keep this under wraps. I didn't want my parents or brother to catch wind of what I was doing. The lawyer confirmed what I suspected. The will had specific conditions that my parents were required to meet to keep the inheritance. For example, they were supposed to allocate a portion of the funds to charitable causes, but as far as I could tell, they hadn't done anything of the sort. Violating those conditions could jeopardize their entire claim to the fortune. Armed with this information, I decided to test the waters one last time. I visited my parents and tried to have a straightforward conversation about their treatment of me and their financial choices. It didn't go well. They brushed me off, saying I didn't understand the complexities of their situation. My mom even laughed and said I was being jealous of Jake's success. That stung, but I held my ground and warned them about the risks of their reckless spending. They dismissed me outright, acting like I was making things up to cause trouble. It was during this visit that I realized Jake was actively encouraging them to shut me out. He'd made himself indispensable to them, acting as their unofficial financial advisor, even though he had zero qualifications. He was also pushing them to update their will to cut me out entirely, claiming it was only fair since I was ungrateful. That was a new low even for him. That's when I decided I needed more than just knowledge. I needed evidence. My parents had always been careless about paperwork, and I knew they kept important documents in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. The next time I visited, I made an excuse to stay late and managed to take photos of anything that seemed relevant. Bank statements, investment reports, and even a copy of the will. It was all there, left unsecured and unorganized. It was almost too easy. Around this time, an unexpected ally came into the picture. My aunt, my dad's sister, reached out to me. She'd noticed the changes in my parents' behavior and wasn't happy about how they were treating me. She didn't want to get directly involved but gave me some valuable information, including details about the charitable stipulations in the will. She also hinted that my parents' reckless spending was starting to raise eyebrows among other relatives. That's when I decided to stir the pot a little. I started planting seeds of doubt among extended family members. I'd casually mention how much my parents were spending or bring up the conditions of the will in passing. It didn't take long for rumors to start spreading. Whispers about their financial recklessness began circulating in the community, adding pressure to their already shaky situation. Jake, of course, wasn't helping matters. During a drunken conversation at a family gathering, he let slip that my parents had taken out a massive loan against one of the properties they'd inherited. He was bragging about how they were leveraging their assets like he was some kind of financial genius, but all it did was confirm that they were living way beyond their means. Then came the breakthrough I was waiting for. While going through the documents I'd collected, I found undeniable proof that my parents hadn't fulfilled key obligations outlined in the will. They were skating on thin ice legally, and it was only a matter of time before it all caught up to them. I decided to speed up the process by filing an anonymous report, prompting an audit of their finances. The fallout was immediate. My parents went into full panic mode as soon as they realized they were under scrutiny. They tried to act like everything was fine, but it was clear they were scrambling. The cracks in their facade were growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before their house of cards came crashing down. The financial audit triggered by my anonymous report hit my parents harder than I expected. Within weeks, they were contacted by tax officials about discrepancies in their filings. It turned out they hadn't paid nearly enough estate taxes and had misrepresented the value of several inherited assets. The audit uncovered fines, back taxes, and penalties that added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a while, they tried to keep the situation quiet, but it didn't take long for word to get out. My parents weren't exactly subtle with their spending, and people in the community noticed when the flashy vacations and luxury purchases suddenly stopped. Jake was the first to react. He stormed into my apartment one night, furious, accusing me of sabotaging the family. He claimed that the audit and all the trouble they were facing were my fault, though he couldn't provide any proof. I barely said a word during his rant. It wasn't worth arguing. His entitlement was on full display as he shouted about how I'd ruined their lives, conveniently ignoring the fact that their mess was entirely self-inflicted. A few days later, I got an email from my parents. It was short and to the point. They were cutting me out of their lives for being toxic. They accused me of turning the family against them and made it clear they wanted nothing to do with me. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. If anything, it made my next steps easier. Without the pretense of a relationship, I could move forward without worrying about how they'd react. I filed a formal legal challenge to the inheritance, using the evidence I'd gathered to prove they'd violated key conditions of the will. The lawyer I consulted had warned me it would be a long process, but I was ready for it. The case was solid. My parents had ignored the charitable stipulations in the will and had mismanaged the estate so badly that it was at risk of collapsing entirely. The lawyer also mentioned that if my challenge succeeded, the inheritance could be redistributed, or even taken away from my parents altogether. As the legal proceedings began, the situation spiraled further out of control for my parents. Their financial troubles became a topic of gossip in the community, and local news outlets picked up on the story. A particularly damning article highlighted their reckless spending and unpaid debts, making them the subject of public ridicule. They tried to downplay the situation, but the damage was done. People who had once admired their sudden wealth now saw them as irresponsible and greedy. Desperation set in quickly. My parents started selling off assets to pay the mounting fines and legal fees. The car they'd bought for Jake was the first to go, followed by one of the properties they'd inherited. It wasn't enough. The more they sold, the more people noticed, and their reputation continued to crumble. Extended family members who had initially supported them began distancing themselves, realizing how badly they'd mismanaged the inheritance. Jake, meanwhile, was in freefall. Without financial support from my parents, his lavish lifestyle came to an abrupt end. He lost his condo when he couldn't afford the mortgage, and his social media posts shifted from exotic vacations to vague complaints about fake people and jealous haters. It was clear he wasn't handling the situation well, but I wasn't about to step in and help. He'd made his choices, just like my parents had. Through all of this, I stayed quiet. I didn't reach out to defend myself or try to explain my side of the story. I didn't need to, everything was unfolding exactly as I'd expected. I continued gathering evidence and working with my lawyer, who uncovered even more violations my parents had made. For example, they'd failed to report rental income from one of the properties they'd inherited, which added another layer of legal trouble to their already massive pile of problems. Then, out of nowhere, my parents reached out to me. It wasn't an apology, exactly, more like an attempt to fix the relationship. They claimed they missed me and wanted to start over, but it was clear they were only reaching out because they needed help. Their finances were in shambles, their reputation was ruined, and they were looking for a lifeline. I refused. I didn't owe them anything, especially after the way they treated me. Shortly after that, another bombshell dropped. A new document from the will surfaced, showing even more conditions my parents had ignored. This document became public during the legal proceedings, further tarnishing their reputation. It detailed how a significant portion of the inheritance was meant for charitable donations, which my parents had completely neglected. The revelation made them look even worse, and the community's opinion of them sank even lower. In the end, my legal challenge succeeded. The court ruled that my parents had violated the terms of the will and could no longer claim the inheritance. The remaining assets were frozen and would be redistributed according to the original stipulations. My parents were left with almost nothing. Jake, who had been so eager to cut me out of their lives, was now facing the same reality: no money, no support, and no way to maintain his previous lifestyle. I didn't celebrate the victory publicly. There was no need. Watching them face the consequences of their actions was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life again, free from their manipulation and toxicity. The fallout wasn't over, but one thing was clear: they'd underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. The court ruling marked the end of my parents' claim to the inheritance. The judge determined they had violated multiple conditions outlined in the will, including their failure to allocate funds to charity and their reckless financial mismanagement. Their behavior left no room for leniency. With the ruling, the remaining assets were redistributed among other family members and the specified charities. My parents were left with almost nothing, aside from the debts they had accumulated trying to maintain their lifestyle. Jake's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He cut ties with my parents, blaming them entirely for losing everything. He told anyone who would listen that they had ruined his life by mismanaging the fortune. It was ironic, considering how much he had benefited from their poor decisions. But now that the money was gone, so was his loyalty. He moved out of their house and stopped speaking to them altogether. For the first time in his life, he was on his own, and it was clear he wasn't handling it well. The financial fallout only got worse. Unable to pay their debts or fines, my parents declared bankruptcy. They had to sell their remaining possessions, including their home. The community, which had once admired their sudden wealth, now saw them as greedy and irresponsible. Former friends distanced themselves, and their social circle shrank to almost nothing. By the end of it, my parents were forced to move into a small rental in a less desirable part of town. They both took on low-paying jobs to make ends meet, a stark contrast to the luxury they had been flaunting not long ago. Jake, meanwhile, was experiencing the struggles of adulthood for the first time. Without my parents' financial support, he bounced between jobs, unable to find anything stable. He had to move into a cramped apartment with roommates and started selling off the designer items my parents had bought for him. His Instagram, once filled with pictures of luxury vacations and fancy dinners, was now quiet. The few posts he made hinted at frustration and bitterness, but the sympathy he was fishing for never came. Throughout all of this, I stayed quiet. I didn't post about it on social media or try to explain my side of the story to anyone. The truth was out there, and I didn't feel the need to defend myself. Still, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as everything settled. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of their toxicity. I'd done what I needed to do, and now I could finally focus on myself. One day, I received a message from a distant cousin. She thanked me for exposing the truth about my parents and shared her own experience of being mistreated by them. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in what I had gone through. She mentioned that the redistribution of the inheritance had allowed her to pay off medical bills that had been weighing on her for years. It felt good to know that the money was finally being used in a way that made a real difference. As for my parents, their attempts to reconcile continued. They sent a letter claiming they wanted to start fresh and rebuild our relationship. It was filled with apologies, but none of them felt genuine. They didn't mention the years of favoritism or the way they had completely disregarded me. It was clear they were only reaching out because they had nothing left. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in reopening that door, especially not after everything they'd put me through. Instead, I focused on my own future. My share of the inheritance wasn't massive, but it was enough to give me a fresh start. I used it to buy a modest home and invest in a small business I'd always dreamed of starting. For the first time, I felt financially secure. I didn't have to worry about making rent or working myself to the bone just to stay afloat. It wasn't just about the money, it was about having the freedom to live life on my terms. In the months that followed, I reflected a lot on everything that had happened. I thought about the lessons my parents had taught me growing up, the importance of hard work, self-reliance, and loyalty, and how they had abandoned those values the moment money entered the picture. Their betrayal hurt, but it also showed me the importance of standing up for myself and refusing to accept less than I deserved. Now I'm building a life without the shadow of my parents' betrayal hanging over me. I've strengthened my relationships with extended family members who supported me, and I've even started making new friends in my community. My business is thriving, and I found a sense of peace I didn't think was possible a year ago. As for my parents and Jake, I don't know what their future holds, and I'm okay with that. They made their choices, and now they're living with the consequences. I don't feel the need to gloat or dwell on their downfall. Knowing that they can no longer enjoy unearned wealth is enough for me. At the end of the day, I'm proud of the person I've become. I've learned that sometimes walking away is the best thing you can do for yourself. I'll always value the lessons I've learned, but I'm leaving the toxicity behind. Life is too short to waste on people who don't value you, and I'm finally free to focus on the things that truly matter. After the court ruling and the redistribution of the inheritance, the ripple effects of my parents' downfall started spreading quickly. Word traveled fast among extended family and old acquaintances, cementing their reputation as reckless and selfish. Relatives who once admired their success began openly criticizing how they'd squandered everything. Friends who had been around during the height of their wealth quietly disappeared. The community didn't see them as victims, they saw them as people who brought this on themselves. Jake's life continued spiraling downward. Without my parents to fund his lifestyle, he jumped from one low-paying job to the next, never staying anywhere for long. He started borrowing money from friends, which caused most of those relationships to fizzle out. His social media, once a highlight reel of luxury, turned into a string of vague complaints and motivational quotes that didn't quite match his situation. There were whispers that he'd been evicted from his apartment and was crashing on friends' couches. His short-term relationships fell apart just as quickly, and his once confident persona began to crack under the weight of reality. My parents didn't fare much better. The bankruptcy left them with no choice but to move into a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town. It was a far cry from the life they'd been flaunting not long ago. They relied on government assistance to cover their basic expenses and took on part-time jobs just to survive. Former neighbors avoided them, and invitations to social events stopped entirely. They went from being the center of attention to being completely isolated. The pressure of their new reality started to take a toll on their relationship. My parents, who had always presented a united front, began blaming each other for their downfall. Arguments became a regular occurrence, and their marriage, already strained, started unraveling. My dad blamed my mom for ignoring the terms of the will, while my mom accused my dad of reckless spending. Their once solid partnership turned into a blame game, with each trying to shift responsibility onto the other. In a desperate attempt to regain some control, my parents tried to file a countersuit against me, claiming I had orchestrated their financial ruin. The case didn't get far. They had no evidence to back their claims, and their mounting legal fees made it impossible for them to pursue it further. The case was thrown out almost as quickly as it was filed, but their attempt to drag me back into their mess only solidified my decision to keep my distance. Amid all this chaos, an unexpected connection emerged. A distant cousin, who had also been excluded by my parents during their short-lived time as wealthy elites, reached out to me. She thanked me for exposing the truth, and shared how she'd been treated dismissively by them when she sought help for her own financial struggles. She mentioned that the redistribution of the inheritance had allowed her to pay off medical bills and start fresh. Hearing her story reminded me that standing up for myself had ripple effects beyond just my own life. While my parents and Jake were struggling, I was finally in a place of stability. The portion of the inheritance I received wasn't massive, but I'd used it wisely. My small business was thriving, and I'd bought a modest home where I could finally feel at peace. I didn't live extravagantly, but for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly worrying about making ends meet. It felt good to know I was building something sustainable. Then, out of nowhere, Jake reached out. He apologized for how he'd treated me during the inheritance fiasco and asked if I could lend him some money to get back on his feet. His tone was softer than I'd ever heard before, but his words rang hollow. I knew this wasn't about reconciliation, it was about desperation. I told him politely but firmly that I couldn't help him. He didn't take it well, accusing me of holding a grudge and refusing to help family. I ended the conversation and haven't heard from him since. Around this time, my parents tried a new tactic, going to the media. They framed themselves as victims of a greedy child who had turned the family against them. The move backfired spectacularly. Local newspapers ran stories not about their claims, but about their attempts to misuse the charitable funds outlined in the will. Public opinion, already against them, turned even harsher. They became a cautionary tale about greed and mismanagement. The stress of their financial ruin began taking a toll on their health. My mom, once so full of energy, started looking frail and exhausted. My dad's temper, which had always been simmering beneath the surface, became more volatile. They made one final plea to reconnect with me, framing it as a chance to heal the family. I didn't respond. I knew this was another attempt to pull me back into their mess, and I wasn't going to let it happen. The turning point for me came when I realized I no longer felt tied to their drama. Their downfall was a result of their own choices, and I didn't owe them anything. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Free to focus on my business, my home, and the relationships that actually mattered. The years of mistreatment and manipulation had taught me valuable lessons about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of walking away from toxicity. Now, as I build a life free from their shadow, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not from their suffering, but from knowing that I stood up for myself and reclaimed my life. They can no longer control me or define my worth, and that's the best outcome I could have hoped for. With everything that happened over the past few years, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel a sense of closure. But now I can confidently say I've moved on from the chaos my parents and brother created. I no longer carry anger toward them. It's been replaced by something quieter, something like indifference. They're not part of my life anymore, and I've made peace with that. After the dust settled, I started reconnecting with extended family members who had their own stories of being mistreated by my parents. A few cousins reached out, sharing how they'd felt excluded or ignored during my parents' rich phase. It was a bittersweet realization that I wasn't alone in how I'd been treated. Together, we've built stronger bonds, finding comfort in knowing we weren't the problem. For the first time, I feel like I'm part of a family that actually supports each other. As for my parents, their situation went from bad to worse. They couldn't afford to stay in the city, so they relocated to a small town a few hours away. From what I've heard, they live in near total obscurity now, in a tiny apartment with barely enough to get by. The few friends they still had cut ties after the media backlash, leaving them socially isolated. The blame game between them hasn't stopped, and their marriage seems to be hanging by a thread. I don't have any direct contact with them, but from what relatives have mentioned, they've hit rock bottom. Jake didn't fare much better. The weight of our family's ruined reputation seemed to follow him everywhere. Eventually, he moved abroad, hoping for a fresh start where no one knew about the mess he'd left behind. But running from your problems doesn't solve them. He's struggling to find steady work and has burned through whatever savings he managed to take with him. The lifestyle he was used to is long gone, and I've heard through the grapevine that he's become increasingly bitter about how things turned out. One of the most satisfying parts of this whole ordeal has been seeing the charitable portion of the inheritance finally go to the causes it was meant for. Thanks to the court ruling, the funds that my parents ignored were distributed to local charities and community projects. Seeing those organizations thrive, whether it's a shelter expanding its services or a scholarship fund helping students, has been a reminder of how wealth can be used for good when handled responsibly. Meanwhile, my life has completely turned around. My small business is thriving far beyond what I initially hoped for. I've been able to expand my services, hire a small team, and even start giving back to the community. It's not just about the financial stability. I've built something I'm proud of, something that reflects my values and hard work. For the first time in years, I feel secure and accomplished. On a personal note, I've also started dating someone who truly values resilience and independence. They've been incredibly supportive, and it's refreshing to be with someone who understands what I've been through without trying to fix or change me. It's early days, but things are going well, and I'm optimistic about the future. My parents haven't stopped trying to reach out, though their attempts have become more desperate. Recently, they sent a handwritten letter, begging for forgiveness and asking for help. The tone was manipulative, filled with guilt-tripping and veiled accusations. They claimed they'd done their best and blamed the situation on circumstances beyond their control. I didn't respond. I saw it for what it was, another attempt to reel me back into their drama. I've worked too hard to build a life free from their toxicity to let them drag me down again. In contrast, the community I've built around me now is one of support and understanding. I've made new friends, joined local groups, and found people who genuinely care about me. It's a stark difference from the relationships I had with my parents and brother, where everything felt like a transaction. These connections fill the void that their absence might have left, and I'm grateful for them every day. Jake, however, hasn't let go of his bitterness. He recently posted a long-winded rant on social media, blaming me for the family's downfall. The post was filled with exaggerated claims and outright lies, but it didn't gain much traction. The few comments it received were unsympathetic, with some even calling him out for his entitlement. It was clear he was trying to garner pity, but no one was buying it. Reflecting on everything, I've realized how much I've rediscovered about myself. The lessons my parents claimed to value, hard work, fairness, and self-reliance, are the same ones they abandoned the moment money came into the picture. But they're also the values I've held on to, and they've guided me through this entire journey. In some ways, their betrayal forced me to become stronger and more self-assured than I ever thought possible. The legal case surrounding the inheritance is now officially closed. With my parents losing all avenues for appeal, there's nothing left for them to fight over. The remaining funds have been allocated as intended, and I've decided to donate a portion of my share to causes I care about. It feels like the right way to honor the original intent of the will and create a legacy my parents never could. Looking back, I acknowledge the pain of their betrayal, but I also see the strength it gave me. It taught me to set boundaries, stand up for myself, and recognize my own worth. I'm no longer defined by their actions or the toxic family dynamics I grew up with. Today, my life is peaceful, fulfilling, and entirely my own. I've closed the chapter on that part of my life, and I'm moving forward with clarity and purpose. The past may have shaped me, but it doesn't define me, and I'm determined to build a future that reflects who I've become.